In our last episode, we talked about summer as a leadership reset, our boundaries, our energy, and what sustainable well-being asks us as individuals. But here's the tension. If the system doesn't change, the leader simply absorbs it again, because personal well-being on its own will never carry a structurally overloaded school. And many leaders recognise that feeling of rested for a moment, but already bracing for September.
You can rest, you can reset, you can come back clearer and steadier. But if nothing changes in how decisions are made, how pressure flows, or how leadership behaves under strain, well-being quietly becomes another thing leaders are expected to manage alone.
So today is about the next step, how individual leadership well-being becomes organisational culture, and what actually shifts when schools stop treating well-being as an add-on and start treating it as an infrastructure. Welcome back to Being the Head, the human cost of leading schools. I'm Jane.
Hi, I'm Jacqui. By the end of today's episode, you'll understand why many well-being strategies don't change lived experience. What actually shifts when well-being becomes leadership infrastructure rather than initiative. And which leadership behaviours matter most under pressure. Plus, one question you can take back to test whether well-being in your school is structural or symbolic. This isn't about adding more, it's about noticing what needs to change.
And today we're really pleased to be joined by Vicci Wells. Vicci is a senior leader at the Youth Sport Trust, where she works nationally with schools, trusts and system leaders to strengthen well-being, inclusion and leadership sustainability through culture, not compliance. Vicci also writes for Young Governor, bringing a governance lens to leadership pressure, accountability and ethical decision-making. Welcome, Vicci.
Hi Jane, hi Jacqui. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Vicci's work sits right at the intersection of leadership, well-being and system responsibility. Not theory, not framework for the shelf, but what actually changes when schools get serious about well-being beyond the individual leader. So, let's get round to the national picture. Recent UK data from Education Support continues to show that teaching and school leadership remain amongst the highest stressed professions. Their latest Wellbeing Index reports that workload intensity, pace, and decision pressure are the strongest predictors of poor mental health. Senior leaders consistently report higher stress levels than classroom staff.
What matters here is that these drivers are structural and not personal. They come from how roles are designed, how urgency is handled, and how risk is distributed, escalated, and absorbed. This isn't about leaders coping better, it's about systems asking better questions. And until we shift from how resilient are our leaders to how intelligently is pressure designed, nothing meaningful changes.
At the same time, inspection frameworks and governance expectations increasingly reference culture, staff experience, and leadership sustainability. Well-being is no longer visible, but neither is inconsistency.
And that creates a real tension for schools. There's pressure to demonstrate well-being, often visibly and quickly, without always changing the underlying conditions that undermine it.
That's where performative well-being creeps in, initiatives layered into existing strain, activities that look caring, but don't change how leaders lead when it matters.
And everybody feels that difference straight away. They know whether well-being holds when decisions are hard, not just when things are calm. Okay, Vicci, let's bring you into this conversation. Building on the idea of leadership well-being, which we explored in our last episode, what do you see as the biggest shift schools need to make when moving from individual well-being to a whole school culture?
Well, thanks, Jane. Really, really great question. And again, thank you for having me on your podcast today. For me, I think the biggest shift schools need to make is moving from seeing wellbeing as something we do for individuals to something we deliberately and intentionally design into the culture and the fabric of our schools. And you've alluded to it there, but I think for a long time, wellbeing in schools has focused quite often on intervention. So, for example, unfortunately, when someone's in crisis, or a staff wellbeing initiative, or a bolt-on programme. And those things matter, of course they do, but they're often quite reactive. So I suppose the work that I'm certainly involved in today has really been about asking, what are the everyday conditions that we create that allow people to feel safe, valued, and able to thrive? And I think that's the leadership shift. I use the term distributed leadership quite a lot in terms of well-being then not being seen as something that's owned by one person, a policy or a week in the calendar. It's owned by absolutely everybody and shaped by how the school operates day to day. It's how adults behave under pressure, how relationships are prioritised, and how movement, play and connection are built into the rhythm of the school. So when schools can make that shift, well-being stops being something extra and becomes a byproduct of a healthy culture.
Yeah, I think that's really key. I think one thing that springs to mind, and I'll never forget it, was in an organisation that I worked in. Leaders were discussing well-being and what it would look like, and a very senior member of the organisation stood up and said, well, actually, well-being is your 13 weeks holiday and your free tea and coffee that you get in the staff room. And that just literally stopped. And the whole sort of really productive conversation that went on with the leaders just halted, and the whole atmosphere changed. And that was from somebody from right at the top.
So I think what you're saying, Jane, is that actually it has to be a whole school initiative, doesn't it? Including a leader and perhaps directors and governance. Vicci and I, we were talking before the pod started about the fact that I come from a sports background. So for me, my Wednesday afternoons was my sport, and it still is. Wednesdays is my sports day, and I've got to go and exercise on that day, and making it integral into giving people ownership and sharing that and making sure people see that you value well-being in other people, it is absolutely key. I mean, we've often heard people say we care about well-being, but the system won't allow us to slow down. From your experience, Vicci, where does leadership still have an agency, even under sustained pressure? Where does that leadership still, for well-being, still happen, do you think, when they've got all these pressures?
Yeah, so Jacqui, I completely understand why leaders say that. The pressure's real, isn't it? Accountability, attendance, budget, recruitment, retention. None of that has eased. But I think what I've learned, certainly through the work of the organisation that I work for, Youth But Trust, and our Well Schools movement, is that agency doesn't disappear under pressure, it just shifts. And whilst leaders might not be able to change national policy, or slow it down rather, they can absolutely shape the climate in their school, and that culture can be incredibly powerful. And if you'll forgive me, and there might be a couple of these throughout the pod today, if I can give a bit of a sporting analogy for you, I often feel leadership, and particularly wellbeing, can be kind of shared and thought about in parallel to Formula One. So Formula One prides itself on being the largest team sport in the world. And I often think leadership and F1, one literally, one figuratively, you're going 200 miles an hour. But the best teams in Formula One know they absolutely have to stop. They have to pit. And they do that because they know it's completely intentional, because they don't see it as slowing down. They see it as a chance to actually gain that competitive edge. So if you skip the pit stop, for example, you might get 1 or 2 extra laps, but eventually mistakes creep in and you can't perform it that way over time. And if we think about well-being and schools in the same way, it often feels like you can't afford to pause. But actually, when you reset, you reconnect, and you look after yourself, you look after your people within your environment, it actually allows you to sustain that performance over time. And if we reflect then what that might mean in a school or a trust environment, it means as a leader, you can control what gets celebrated in your school. You can control how your meetings are run within your environment. And you can control where staff feel psychologically safe to say, I'm struggling. And all of those things don't require the system to slow down. They require intentional leadership. And actually, a head said to me not too long ago, when we were looking at some of our work organisationally, the head said, yes, it's a leap of faith, but the community will be your safety net. And I really like that approach.
And could you just expand on the Well Schools movement that you're working in at the moment?
Yeah, sure. So first and foremost, Youth Sport Trust, who I work for, is a children's charity that believes in the power of sport to change children and young people's lives. And Well Schools is a particular movement we're incredibly proud of. It's a movement of over 2,000 schools and trusts now. And ultimately, it's all about taking positive action to improve educational outcomes by improving the health and, importantly, happiness of young people, but also staff. Completely free to access. It's about a movement by schools for schools that share really great practice and review their provision. And it's grounded in, Jacqui, the fact that well-being is everything from the foundations of our staff, our pupils, their priorities around health and well-being, and has 3 pillars: well-led, well-prepared and well-equipped. And it's all about schools and trusts sharing what works in those areas to support other schools. So it's an opportunity. We just help facilitate it, and absolutely it's schools supporting each other across the sector.
Thank you.
I think that really, that example sort of leads nicely into the next question, really, Vicci, was, so often in schools we see leader authored tools, and honest self-review seem to land, for what you've just explained, far more strongly than with staff than those externally imposed frameworks. But why do you think resources shaped by that lived leadership experience resonates more deeply?
I think, Jane, it comes down to, for me, credibility and permission. So when a resource is shaped by lived or even living experience, it carries a different weight. It says, I've stood where you're standing. I know the pressure. I know the trade-offs. And that, for me, can create trust straight away. I think sometimes we've probably all had experiences of this. Externally imposed frameworks can sometimes feel like it's just another thing being done to us as leaders. But when tools are authored by leaders or shaped through honest self-review, they can really feel then like something that's being built with them. And there's real humility in that. And again, through the work that I've been involved in, we've seen the most powerful change doesn't come from the glossy documents. It comes from leaders having the courage to say, here's what we're grappling with, here's what's working, here's what we're still learning. And that vulnerability, I think, is where other staff and schools can connect with. And I think when other schools or staff or other leaders see that honesty, when they see one another engaging in genuine self-reflection rather than compliance, it signals this isn't a tick box exercise. It's a shared commitment. And I suppose ultimately, people don't buy into frameworks, do they? They buy into authenticity.
Yeah.
And leadership, well-being, whole school culture are all built on trust.
Can you just give us one example that you've seen in, with the organisation and the many organisations that you've worked with, the organisations that you've supported, that really made that deep-rooted, significant difference in well-being culture for a school or an organisation?
Yeah, so I think it builds on what I shared previously around the Well Schools movement. So as part of the Well Schools movement, and again, completely free to access, that was really important to us when we were working with the sector, that it's not a barrier if there's a kind of cost piece behind it, is the Well School Check. And that was all authored by leaders and schools and settings that were from mainstream primary, secondary, but specialist alternative provision. So again, it has to be able to be applied in all of the different educational settings that we work with across the sector. And that was a really challenging process. So leaders were fantastic in saying that won't work, or Youth Sport Trust, that is helpful, but also that's not helpful. So really helped us ground a series of self-review questions against the 3 pillars that I mentioned. But importantly, as they went through that process, then brought to life examples of where it's worked incredibly well. So I've seen leaders that, for example, have protected things like break times and play and movement, even under periods of significant pressure. So talking through, well, what does that actually look like? How have I been able to do that at those significant times? And that's that authenticity and sharing of practice, I think, that's working really well. And what we have seen is the volume of schools that have gone through the review. Again, that speaks for itself. If it wasn't something that felt credible in this space or valued, I just think schools wouldn't use it.
Thank you.
Vicci, that's so interesting, isn't it? But when it becomes a performative thing. So it's a tick box exercise, particularly around when you're trying to do something to get a better outcome in inspections or something. Do you see that as being a real risk to the trust and culture over time? Have you seen that in your travels and you're working with your schools, where it just becomes that tick box exercise?
Yeah,
Wellbeing.
absolutely, Jacqui. I think I've seen some wonderful examples where schools get it right, and you can feel it. Like when you go into that school, you
Yeah.
really feel it. But I've also seen examples of where that hasn't necessarily worked. And interestingly, as part of the research that we're doing around well schools, so again, it's really important we have some evidence to ground what works and what doesn't. There's some emerging findings that are going to be coming out soon that talk about the virtuous cycle and the vicious cycle. And I think I've seen examples of both from schools where you perhaps keep doing what you've always done, or it's quite performative, but not getting the results that you want across your staff and ultimately for your young people. So again, would be very happy to share that with you when that's published. And I think when wellbeing does become performative, i.e., I don't know, it's amplified before inspection, for example, or packaged up for accountability, people notice and staff notice. And importantly, and what I've seen actually is young people notice, the pupils in our school notice when that's not working properly. And I think people, once they sense that something's being done for optics rather than belief, it can chip away at psychological safety, because the message it sends unintentionally, I think, is that wellbeing matters when we're being watched, not because it's a core value, and culture just can't thrive in that space. I'm a big fan of Lisa Cherry's work. She's an educational psychologist, got a lot of her content. And what really strikes me when Lisa speaks is the art of noticing. And she talks about the art of noticing what is happening, but also the art of noticing what is not happening. And I've really seen that when I've gone into settings or I've chatted with leaders. It's not necessarily observing what you can currently see in front of you, but actually what are you not seeing? What are you hearing? But also what are you not hearing? Who's offering those conversations in your school? And I think then if wellbeing is genuinely rooted in genuine values rather than performance inspection or simply just a quick moment of reflection, it's a much healthier place for any school community to be.
Yeah. We had a very wise director of education when we trained, and she said, always look to see what they're not saying. And I think that follows it, doesn't it, Vicci? We're constantly looking now about those leaders that don't show up to things and don't turn up and don't offer anything. And that's always really key for us to then ask and get a check-in. And Jane's really good at checking in with people, aren't you, Jane, and making sure that they're working well and that you're covering everything. So thank you for that.
Going back to that genuine infrastructure around wellbeing rather than initiative, with your governor's hat on and your trustee director's hat on, what questions should governors and trustees be asking leaders that go beyond that reassurance? You know, what would intelligent oversight look like in practice, I think is what I'm asking.
I love the fact that you've asked that question, Jane, I think, and I know you know me incredibly well. I've been involved in governance and various trustee roles for over a decade. I think my daughter started school at the age of 4 and she's now reaching near the end of year 10 with GCSEs leaving. And it's incredibly important that governors and trustees are involved in those conversations and really treating wellbeing as something that is an infrastructure rather than an initiative, actually treating it as they would safeguarding or finance, something that's structural, not seasonal. So I think when we think about that intelligent oversight, the questions shift. So instead of asking what wellbeing programs are we running, for example, then they might ask, what are the conditions in this school that enable people to thrive? But also, how do we know? And I think that intelligent oversight goes beyond reassurance. It looks for patterns, it looks for alignment and lived experience. So, for example, there might be questions such as, how does staff turnover correlate with workload and culture? Are break and movement times protected? And I mean that for staff as well as pupils, even under pressure. And triangulating the information you are presented with, really thinking about, are you in those corridors? Do you feel it? Would staff describe it the same way as senior leaders do if you're in a school? Certainly in the work that I do, particularly in the governance space, always try and ensure that those conversations, when we're looking at this and I'm triangulating the evidence, we're in a school environment. So you can talk about this around the governing board table, but you can't see and feel it around the governing board table. So I think that's a really important part of many of these conversations. And I suppose through my experiences, I have seen the most effective governors and trustees are curious rather than punitive. So they create the space for that reflective conversation, and they're also willing to hear. We're not there yet from leaders, and recognizing that culture work is long term, isn't it? Because ultimately, I think intelligent oversight is about asking, and I ask myself this question a lot in all of the governance conversations that I'm involved in. Are we building a school, or are we building a trust where people can sustain their energy and purpose over time? Or actually, are we slowly depleting it? And that's a much deeper governance conversation than simply checking that we have a wellbeing policy.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's that culture. The culture takes a long time to build. But I suppose it's going back to a term that we picked up in a conversation we had a couple of months back about that ecosystem. And that ecosystem within a school is so very fragile. It, can be so easily damaged just by one comment, one issue. Yeah. Thank you, Vicci.
I love that phrase, Vicci, that you said, intelligent oversight, and also triangulating that information. So asking those questions about what conditions do allow people to thrive. What do we actually need to do? I think there's a big mismatch in a tick box exercise, and we have days, we're offering days where they can X, Y, and Z, and we give those days without that actual infrastructure underneath a school culture to allow this, and that longevity about, what do we do to provide that as well? So it's sustainable. If you lose that key one person, so you lose the leader of that school who really values it and has put a lot of effort into it, then it falls back on that governance to make sure that it does actually stay in that infrastructure for a longer period. I think that's an absolute vital piece of work. And I think that's when I look back at our own experiences, both Jane and I, it was more about that directorship, that governance, not understanding that and allowing that to happen, really. And I think there's a lot more work that can be done around governance on this, because I think they come to it with a different idea. And if they hear directly just from the head teacher about it, then it can all fall apart if that one person goes, or for whatever reason has a different idea about what that should look like as well. So a lot more work that can be done, I think, there.
I think
Vicci,
sorry,
go on.
I think at a leadership level as well, just going back to, your analogy at the start about Formula One and about schools having a pit stop. And I fell into the same trap of, actually, if we have a wellbeing day, or if we have this, and it was sort of like add-ons. And actually, having gone through burnt out, those days made no difference. It was what I was having to face every single day. And I think schools and school leaders are so, I don't want to use the word overwhelmed, but they are so, they are spinning so many different plates that they're not actually taking a pit stop to look at how can they authentically change that leadership infrastructure so they're not constantly on that sort of treadmill, and that those adding on those bits. And I think it's allowing themselves, giving themselves permission to take a breath, take a step back, and actually look that authentically look like, for not just them but for everybody, I think. So yeah.
I think, Jane, they need, you use that word permission when you said that actually some people need to understand. And I think for myself, if I look back at it, to take a day out to reflect, I felt guilty about taking a day out, because when you went back, and you must have this, Vicci, when you go back, if you take a day doing X, Y, and Z, which is a really productive day out of where your normal daily routine, you go back to picking up that day's work as well. So it's that, oh no, I can't do that. But actually, taking that day to reflect and that pit stop is so much worthwhile. And the research around how schools get better is by taking those pit stops. So we've got to learn from that, I think, and we've got to have that governance and that directors who understand that as well, because that's key to this. Okay, I want to go strip this right back and make it really, really simple. for people, as simple as we can possibly make it. If a leader could change just one belief about well-being this year and nothing else, what do you think that belief would fundamentally alter how their school feels? If it could only be one thing.
It is tough. I will absolutely do my best there. And I will come back to another sporting analogy here. And I think it would be view well-being as the training ground, not the trophy. Because too often we focus on the visible wins and that's within education, it's within sport, it's within broader life, test scores, performance targets, awards, without always thinking about the conditions that make success possible. But actually, if leaders can invest in the training ground, so that's the relationships, routines, energy, connection, everything else naturally improves. And I genuinely think, and where I talk a lot around school improvement with leaders, invest in the training ground, get it right with well-being, the rest will follow.
I think that's something that will really resonate with our leaders. If you can get that right and you can invest in it, it's going to make a massive difference. This feels like a really natural reflection point. Vicci, looking back over your leadership roles that you've undertaken, what do you wish you knew that you know now?
Great question, Jacqui. And as you say, I've had a number of roles across sport and education and trust governance and things. And I suppose across all of those, what I wish I'd known earlier was, and we've talked a little bit about this already on the pod today, how much culture flows from the small everyday choices we as leaders make, not just big initiatives or policies. It's the small, consistent actions. So check-ins with your team, the way you prioritize play or connection, the language that you use, that actually makes the biggest difference over time. And investing in that as the foundation makes everything possible. And genuinely now that is something I carry into every role and all the roles that I hold now.
Yeah, I think everybody could relate to that, totally relate to that issue about actually, for me, it's also about, I thought the nicer I was in that would have a correlation to their well-being. So I didn't design it in. I would be very accommodating when people came and asked for things. So it goes back to Vicci right to the start where you say it's about a plaster, isn't it, over the top of something. It isn't about that design and thinking it through as to how it's going to affect it. It's just that knee-jerk reaction. Let's put a day in for this. Let's put a day in for that. And it worked on superficial level, but actually deep down, you just had to knock at the foundations and it would all collapse, really. So, yeah, for me, it would be about it scales through design. What about you, Jane?
I think for me, I think what I've learned, and this was the hard way, was that leadership well-being really, that depends on an individual stamina, will always collapse under structural strain eventually. And that, leadership well-being sort of stays, when it stays personal, it stays fragile. And it can only really become sustainable when it's built into how decisions are made, how it's reviewed, that challenge, and particularly under those periods of pressure. If only we could go back.
I know. I mean, I always did used to pause, and I think culture does shift when leaders model pause. And I was absolutely firm on my Wednesday afternoons and insisted. And I've talked about it in other pods, Vicci. I used to get changed and I used to go to the gym on a Wednesday. And I also talked to my governors about, please don't put any meetings on a Wednesday. Please don't do this, because I will be in the gym at a certain time. And it wasn't until after school, but they would see me on a Wednesday regularly. It took a while, Vicci, but after about a year of me doing that, and they could see me doing that, they would do the same as well. I pulled off to the local gym down the road, which happened to be a very nice hotel. And I said, would they subsidise my teachers to have cheaper gym fees? And they did. And so it was finding those ways to have that pause, but also to model in. I think it's really important that leaders model that well-being as well, and also admit when they're not having the best of times. Because we are very good at the swan in leadership and education. We're very good at hiding our stresses because we think that is the right way to go. I've got to have the stiff upper lip. I've got to carry on because I will be judged as failing if I don't. And then that's the culture I think we need to shift in this country around education, is actually you are going to have times where you're not going to get everything right. You are going to have times where you're going to feel the pressure, but you need to show that because that's human. And people will respect you more for being able to show that rather than the robot that we are portrayed to have through the education system. That's quite radical, isn't it? I shouldn't have probably said that.
It's like I said last night. It's like I said last night, Jacqui, with that session we ran for those executive leaders. You know, showing vulnerability is actually a strength, and it takes a strong person to be vulnerable with their peers. And I think, you know, it needs to happen. Something needs to change. Something needs to change.
Vicci, do you see that? Do you see that on your travels with heads and leaders when you're doing your work? Do you see that there is a bit more of a shift to people realizing that vulnerability and showing vulnerability is important or not?
Yeah, I genuinely do, Jacqui. And as I say, I've seen that done incredibly well and role modelled really well. And then I've also seen examples where it's not. And I think, as you say, you know, that culture piece where you can visibly see leaders living and breathing it, it naturally, just organically helps ripple through the fabric of a school. So I've seen heads, for example, their everyday outfit. Yes, they might have to obviously look very, you know, suit and things if they've got things, but they've got trainers on. And what they'll do is they'll say, right, we'll have a meeting, but we'll go for a walk and we'll do it that way, and just building in things throughout the day. But I've also seen, I know we've talked a lot there about the benefits of physical activity for well-being, but also recognising individual staff choice around how that supports their well-being can look very, very different. It might be the individual who needs to leave, I don't know, dead on the end of a school day once a week to go and be able to make pickup, or to have some energy to be able to play with their children at the end of the day, so they're not able to kind of stay and do some of the other things. And so it's just getting to know your staff body, rippling it out from the top, modelling it, showing those vulnerabilities when it is challenging to be able to do that. But then also ensuring you're really listening to your staff body and just working out what are the things that would make the greatest difference for their well-being, and not assuming that if we do this, then actually it will help everybody's well-being.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, isn't it? It's knowing your staff really well, because what I enjoy for well-being might be completely different to somebody else. And that getting your mindset into that is about listening to your staff and having that pause time. It all comes back to that pause time and reflection time and being able to listen to your staff. And so you can plan well for it as well, can't you? And then it becomes integral into the system. Yeah, really good. Thank you. Shall we move on to top tips then? If you could give one tip to our listeners, what would it be and why?
These are challenging questions, Jacqui.
I know.
I could probably give quite a few more than one. But if I had to give just one, I would say, look, in sport, the best strategy fails if players don't trust each other. And in schools, the best plans fail if staff and pupils don't feel seen, supported and connected. So my top tip would be prioritise relationships first. Everything else will follow. And that, for me, can be the game changer.
Absolutely fabulous. Yeah. Prioritise people. And I always say, well, what's the biggest spend in your budget? Because it all comes back to finance, doesn't it? You know, how much money. So what is the biggest spend? And they will always come back people. I said, so that's where you have to invest. That is your biggest asset, is the people that you employ into your school, and have those conversations with people. Yeah.
Sorry, before we let you go, Vicci, I know Jacqui's got one more question she'd like to ask.
I have, Vicci, and it's a question I usually ask a lot of people who come on the pod. Is there one question that we've not had opportunities to ask you that you would want us to ask you?
Great question, Jacqui. I think if I can bring it back to the title of this podcast, which is obviously around well schools without the fluff, I suppose it would be the question, why do you think people view this sometimes as fluffy and as fluff? And I suppose what I would have said if you'd asked that question was genuinely thinking, I shared it in the top tip, that this could be one of the single most impactful school improvement levers that you have as a leader. If you can invest in those relationships and people. And again, if we think about our leaders who might be in charge of 100 plus staff, who in turn might be in charge of 1,600 plus young people, the fact that you could get people in your school feeling valued, heard, listened, you create that culture, those staff will feel hopefully more energized and happy in their work. What will that mean? Well, pupils will feel it because teachers are happier and energized within their lessons. So your pupils will benefit and your people will be happier and healthier as a result. That hopefully then translates into what that looks like for your educational outcomes. And again, can be delivered at low cost. We've spoken about some of the cost around some of these initiatives, actually just getting to know your staff, being able to put some of those things in place that you know will really help support them, I think could be a significant game changer in school improvement.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. If we can invest that time, that is the one thing that will make massive, massive difference to your school and your culture around your school, and everybody benefits. Everybody benefits. So thank you for that, Vicci. If we want to find more, I mean, a lot of people listen to this podcast as they're driving to work, and so they don't often click on our show notes. We would encourage you, please, to share it with other head teachers so they can benefit from this conversation. But if they want to find out more, Vicci, about the work that you do, where would they go to find it? What Google search would they do to find you and the work that you're doing?
So quite simply, I would include Youth Sport Trust, Well Schools, and everything that I've spoken about, what the Well School movement is, and the Well School check. So if nothing else, have a look at that Well School check when you've Googled and you've pulled it up. What will it be? Low risk, maximum an hour to dive in, have a look at it. It might just give you a few thoughts, but equally, it might ask you those significant questions that could massively change the culture and impact across your school.
Thank you so much. We will put that link in the show notes as well. But if this episode has helped you think more structurally about wellbeing, that's exactly the thinking space we try to do to protect through Being the Head, leadership, support and insurance. No advice, no fixes, but a place for leaders to test judgment and sustained good decision making. There's some more information about that on our website. If you'd like to go to that, that's www.beingthehead.co.uk.
This has been Being the Head, the human cost of leading schools. We see you, we hear you, and we'll see you next time.